Good morning, and welcome back. While I have your attention, lower mids, we need some wrestlers. Come on out. That's not the purpose of my meeting here today, but as long as I've got you. All right, this summer, we read Mudbound, a compelling tale. Some of us apparently read Mudbound. A compelling tale of a critical moment in American history where the South began to change, but that change came at a horrible price. This has also come at a moment when race has become the omnipresent question in America today. Of course, race has always been central to understanding America, and I'd like to take you through that understanding now, if I may. First of all, it's important to understand that race doesn't exist, not biologically. What we call race is often no more than an evolutionary adaptation to environment. In northern latitudes, skin needed to take in more sunlight for vitamin D, so the skin had less melanin than skin in tropical latitudes. But from this single biological marker, an entire theory of civilization sprung up, in the European world in general, but with special virulence in the United States. The story of race in America is as old as the earliest European settlers. In the early 1600s, land was plentiful, but labor was scarce, especially in the lucrative tobacco colony of Virginia. Because mortality was so high from disease and warfare with Native Americans, settlers preferred short-term workers, indentured servants, who would come and work for usually 7 years, then become free. However, in 1676, these former indentured servants rose up against the planter elite in an event known as Bacon's Rebellion. At exactly the moment that Native Americans had mostly been eradicated as a threat, suddenly the white underclass turned on the wealthy planters. Once the rebellion was put down, these planters made two big changes. First, they would stop importing so many troublesome temporary servants and begin importing large numbers of African slaves. Slaves were much more expensive, but since they were never freed, they represented a permanent form of wealth. Secondly, they began to treat these poor whites with some deference, as if they were equals. And at the root of this equality was race. As poor as a white farmer on the frontier was, he was not an African slave or a Native American. So ideas of racial superiority, which already existed in Europe, were bound to the idea of race-based slavery a full century before a white slave-owning Virginian wrote in the Declaration of Independence that, quote, all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The very existence of African slaves in the colonies created a political class of white men who might enjoy very different economic circumstances, but were bound together by the color of their skin. Historian Edmund Morgan has argued that the very ideals of American democracy grew up bound firmly to the idea and the presence of African and eventually African-American slaves. When Patrick Henry thundered, "Give me liberty or give me death," who better to know the difference between tyranny and liberty than a man who exercised tyranny over human beings every single day of his adult life? Nevertheless, any thinking person could see how the existence of slavery was a massive hypocrisy in the birthplace of modern democracy. For decades after America won its independence, Southerners debated with themselves whether they could find a way to end slavery. Some, like George Washington, freed their slaves at their death, but others, like Thomas Jefferson, saw their slaves sold off at their death to pay off debts. Among those sold by Jefferson's estate were his own children. And very, very few people proposed that if slavery were to end, that slaves would be allowed to remain in the United States. The very idea of race-based slavery rested on the idea that African Americans were inferior in mental and moral development. To admit anything else would create a rupture in the entire logic of American society in the 19th century. As Chief Justice Roger Taney argued in the Dred Scott decision, quote, "A black man has no rights that a white man is bound by law to respect," end quote. Not only were slaves not citizens, but the logic of racism meant that even free African Americans were of dubious citizenship. Ultimately, this issue led to the Civil War. Make no mistake, the cause of the Civil War was primarily about whether slavery would spread into the West. Very few Northerners cared at all about the slaves. In fact, just the opposite. They simply did not want to live side by side with slaves. Eventually, the Civil War became about, as Lincoln said, a new birth of freedom and the end of chattel slavery in the United States. But before the last echoes of gunfire had faded away and the ink had dried on the 13th Amendment freeing the slaves, the white South rose as one to re-subjugate the newly freed slaves through legal means such as black codes and through illegal means such as the wholesale slaughter of freed slaves, such as the Colfax Massacre in 1873, where over 100 freedmen were killed. For roughly a decade, the North made some inconsistent attempts to suppress these efforts, as much out of a desire for Republican votes as for any love as the freedmen for human beings. But efforts were made, especially under President Ulysses S. Grant. However, by the time of the centennial in 1876, the North had grown tired of trying to fix race relations in the South. And so the decade of Reconstruction, a noble experiment to root out racial castes in the South, was allowed to die. And the country embarked on a period of profound racism that permeated all aspects of American society. In 1882, the United States for the first time barred migration from a place, in this case China. Massachusetts Senator George Hoare described it as, quote, nothing less than the legalization of racial discrimination, end quote. In 1896, the Supreme Court gave its blessing to segregation in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. In 1898, America seized and then held the Philippines because they felt that Filipinos, as non-whites, were incapable of self-rule, the so-called white man's burden. When Filipinos rose up in opposition to this, they were rounded up into concentration camps and many were tortured. In fact, after the Philippine War, the military banned waterboarding only to bring it back 100 years later against another ethnically different group of people in Iraq. This period from 1876 to 1945 was remarkable in the breadth and depth of its racism. Teddy Roosevelt engaged in race-based foreign policy against the Japanese and the Colombians. He touched off several decades of treating the people of the Caribbean basin as little more than troublesome children. Woodrow Wilson resegregated the federal workforce. His legacy is being called into question by protesters at Princeton University, where he was both a professor and a college president. Warren Harding met with Ku Klux Klan leaders in the Oval Office. In fact, the state of Indiana was more or less run by the KKK for much of the 1920s. During this time period, families would go to county fairs and enter their children into eugenics competitions. The child with the blondest hair, the fairest skin, and the bluest eyes was judged the superior child, and the parents were rewarded for their fine Nordic stock the way you would be for a prized bull. Other American eugenicists advocated for the sterilizing of anyone who was deemed socially undesirable, a group that naturally included many minorities. When Adolf Hitler rose to power, he based some of his thinking and practice on ideas he had taken from American eugenicists. It is worth noting that the logic of racism didn't end with white, black, Native American, and Asian. It extended to almost everyone. In fact, everyone stand up. This is where I'd have to wake up Zach Ambrosino. If you're Asian, South Asian, African American, African, or Hispanic, go ahead and sit down. It doesn't matter if only a great-grandparent belonged to these groups. There was something called the one-drop rule. One drop of non-white blood was enough. Now, if any of your ancestors were Jewish or Italian or Slavic or Greek, if they did not come from England, Germany, Scandinavia, or France, go ahead and sit down. Heck, actually, the Irish too. Go ahead and sit down. If you have Irish blood, sit down. How about Catholic? If you're Catholic, go ahead and sit down. And the logic of racism was extended to gender so the women can sit down. Okay, those of you that are still standing can sit down. Now I'm standing too, I'm part of that group. Not just because I'm at the podium. That group that was left standing at the end, we are the people that America was understood to belong to. None of the people in that group, as far as I know, is guilty of any racial crime or animosity. But if you are unaware of the fact that as late as 1960, it was an open question whether a Catholic could be elected president. If you are unaware that as late as the summer of 2008, many African Americans just assumed there was no way Barack Obama would be allowed to win a presidential election. If you are unaware that there are living memories of racial segregation in the South, then you are unaware of the country you're living in. The book Mudbound takes place at that moment when things began to change. There were many reasons why America and the American South began to change. Not the least of it was the power of television to take the brutality of the enforcement of Jim Crow and bring it into American living rooms. Not the least was a movement that consisted both of extraordinary leaders and extraordinary ordinary people who came together to end a system that had always been at odds with America's sense of itself. To understand this racist legacy is not to say that America is a uniquely awful place. The very ideals that motivated slave owners like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison created a system where change was slow but change was possible. And those changes, once won, would be very hard to undo. America was not then, nor is it now, an especially racist place. The attacks in Paris were committed almost entirely by people living in Belgium and France. People who have struggled and failed to find acceptance in European society, so they turn to awful violence as an expression of their alienation. Amazingly, America has been largely spared these outbursts. In fact, a great deal of the political violence in this country is committed by white supremacists. Just this past week, white supremacists shot up a protest of the Black Lives Matter movement in Minnesota. If anything, this demonstrates that the past of white supremacy is no longer legitimate in this country, and therefore violence is their only language. Or maybe it was always the first language of white supremacy. Whether it was the beatings administered to slaves, the ethnic cleansing of the Cherokee, the exclusion of the Chinese, the waterboarding of the Filipinos, the internment of Japanese Americans, or the long, slow strangulation of Jim Crow, violence has always been a part of our legacy. And it is important that we look this past fully in the face. But we must understand the complexity of this issue. Princeton students want to strip Woodrow Wilson's name from several buildings, including the prestigious Wilson School of International Affairs. Wilson was an unapologetic racist. This is undeniably true. But he also came from a paternal school of racism, where the logic of racism was the same logic of Teddy Roosevelt's embrace of the white man's burden. To put it in terms of Mudbound, Wilson represented a person like Henry, the stolid, decent older brother. He wasn't like the almost cartoonishly evil Pappy or some of the townspeople. But Henry is steeped in a culture of racism, a culture that extends back centuries and across oceans. Henry is both a decent man and a racist, just as a man like Woodrow Wilson was a good and moral man while simultaneously embracing a theory of race that is incompatible with our values today. To look at history is to look with an objective eye at men like Henry or Wilson or Jefferson, is to judge them on their whole lives and not just those elements where they fall short of our standards today. This is not to dismiss those shortcomings, but rather to understand that the ideas elucidated by Martin Luther King were simply not present in many people's lives. Racism is best understood not as a personal choice, but as an omnipresent culture. Something so prevalent as to go unnoticed and uncriticized until that moment when suddenly it is unavoidable to do so. Moments such as the Battle of Battery Wagner, where African American soldiers charged into certain death and demonstrated in Frederick Douglass's words, quote, "Will a slave fight? No. But will a black man fight? Yes." That moment changed the course of the Civil War and eventually led directly to the 13th Amendment, ending slavery, the 14th Amendment, granting African American citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, giving black men the vote. The logic of slavery and of racism suggested that former slaves could not fight because they lacked courage. Battery Wagner demonstrated that perhaps courage was the thing those runaway slaves had the most of. Moments such as Birmingham and Selma, where the violence that cemented Jim Crow segregation in place was laid bare for the world to see. And moments such as Ferguson and Baltimore and Charleston and Cleveland and now Minneapolis, where we are forced to witness the legacy of a system older than our country continuing to reap the lives of African Americans. My own grandfather was in many ways like Henry McCallan, though perhaps a little more genteel. He was a good man, a kind man, a generous man. He was the most Christian man I knew, modest, thoughtful, and gentle. When I was working on my research paper at Taft in 1984, I came across a pamphlet he wrote when he was running for lieutenant governor of Georgia in the 1950s. He made a not unconvincing argument that the process by which the 14th Amendment was passed was unconstitutional. I was aghast. Pop was, by all accounts, a racial moderate. Yet here he was arguing to overturn the idea of birthright citizenship. When we spoke about it, he expressed the logic of, such as it is, of paternalism, that some blacks simply need to be looked after. He had had sharecroppers, both black and white, and treated them with respect, much the same way Henry treated the Jacksons. He was the only merchant in town to offer credit to African-American customers. But he was a Southerner. Just like Henry, just like Woodrow Wilson, and he was an American. I don't love him any less because of what he believed. I believe it was wrong, but I've come to understand why he believed it. To ask him not to believe it would be asking him to deny 3 centuries of cultural programming. Some men and women choose to hate because of some malignancy inside them. Oftentimes, they're as much a victim of that malignancy as those they seek to oppress. But more often than not, we are a product of the culture we grow up in. Our culture today, both at Taft and more generally, denies the logic of racism. That doesn't mean it doesn't still exist, but it has difficulty surviving in daylight. In the aftermath of the Charleston shooting, the South Carolina legislature voted to remove the Confederate battle flag, a symbol of racism and secession and Jim Crow. The majority white Southern legislature looked at the slaughter in the Emmanuel AME Church, looked at the awesome grace of the families in the face of hatred and said, we can change. We should change. I am rarely completely shocked, but I was completely shocked. South Carolina. We must understand our history. We must understand all the complicated, messy parts of it, but we must not be bound by it. In fact, only by truly understanding a Thomas Jefferson, a Woodrow Wilson, a man like my grandfather, fully and completely understand them, can we understand the path we ourselves must make. If so, then we are not, in fact, mud-bound. If so, then our past is the hill we can stand upon to see the broad horizon. America is a never-ending experiment in trying to make a more perfect union. It does not exist as a perfect union. That restless sense of improvement is America's gift to the world. That sense that everything can be made better. And as Taft students, that is your obligation to the world. Know the rocky terrain you and your ancestors have trod, but take that perspective and keep your eyes always fixed on that broad horizon. Thank you.